And we have her with us tonight, and that is amazing. Welcome, Maude Barlow.
Thank you, sweetie. All right. Wow, thank you very much. Sorry for that dramatic entrance. I've got the tail end of a week cold, and the antibiotics do things to my system. I thought, okay, I have 400, 500 people here, and I've just been introduced, and I'm going to go to the washroom first. So there you are. We are all very human. Merci, Marcos. C'est un grand plaisir d'être ici ce soir. Thank you to Deborah and Patricia for your very moving opening. Thank you to Ron for those absolutely gorgeous words. And one of the things that I think we have to be most conscious of is that, and I'll probably talk a wee bit more about this in detail, but as the Harper government is killing all of the what I call rules and tools that we've had to protect our fresh water, really it is the First Nations governance and First Nations laws and treaties that are all that's left between us and absolutely no protection. So it's not just a case of saying, we support First Nations. Rather, it's a case of saying you are taking the leadership now because you have the power. You never ceded the power, and we, in fact, have ceded the power to these terrible governments, and now we will follow. I mean, when Ron talked about catching up, I think in a way now it's going to be the other way around, and I'm really excited by what I've seen in the 2 days that I've been here in terms of that coalition working. Thank you to the Memramcook Action Group, Water Environment Protection for Albert County, Tantrament Alliance Against Fracking, the Clean Energy Alliance, New Brunswick Water First, all of the groups that have been involved in this. And I want to say a big shout out to support the court injunction of the groups that have, we heard about a little bit about this earlier, but it is an incredibly important way that we can move forward, and we support it at the council, and I'm hoping others will too. And I think there may be other injunctions from other perspectives or other court challenges, and I think we should just challenge both the federal government and the provincial government with everything we have. We just have to throw the books at them one after the other. I'd also like to say a very warm welcome to the new Council of Canadians chapter in this city. I'm just delighted it joined St. John and Fredericton. When I was in Fredericton last night, we had a wonderful event at a home of some of the chapter members there, and when I had been there 2 years ago, there wasn't a chapter, so it was really exciting to see these new chapters. And a special shout out to Angela Giles, our wonderful organizer for Atlantic Canada. And we have two board members in the room, Letitia Adair from St. John and Leo Broderick from Prince Edward Island, and a whole contingent came over from Prince Edward Island tonight. So this is very exciting. So what I want to talk to you about tonight is going to start out in the world and come back a little to Canada and come back to New Brunswick, because those of us who live in this country are blessed to live in a place that still has per capita more water than most people on earth. It's absolutely true. We're not water rich in the way we are told by the companies or some governments. They'll say we have 20% of the world's water. Well, we actually only have 20% if you were to drain every lake, river, and aquifer, and we would become a desert. We have about 6.5% of the available fresh water. And that's the water you can use without destroying the source itself. And we are doing everything we can to deplete and ruin that. So we have nothing, I can assure you, to be proud of. But we still have more available water than most. And what I want to start off talking about tonight is that the fight that we're putting forward here in New Brunswick around fracking and other threats, like the Eastern Pipeline, to our water sources here and around the country, really takes place in a situation that we have to look at globally. And the story is very clear. I mean, we all learned back in grade 6 or something that you can't run out of water, that there's this hydrologic cycle and it goes round and round and it doesn't go anywhere, right? And that's not true. I mean, the water is still somewhere here on the planet, but in fact, what we know now is that we are depleting, diverting, and displacing the available fresh water so that we can no longer get at it. A colleague of mine calls it modern water, and that our modern society has seen water as a resource for our pleasure, profit, and convenience. And so we move water where we want to, and we don't stop and think about the consequences. We dump whatever we want into water, having learned that lesson, that myth of abundance, that it could never run out. And in fact, what we're doing is that we are using bore well technology that didn't exist 60 years ago, and we are pulling up groundwater so fast around the world that a recent study said that if the Great Lakes are being pumped as fast as groundwater is being pumped around the world, the Great Lakes could be bone dry in 80 years. We're also damming our rivers to death in order to produce irrigated crops for the global food chain. And one of the biggest culprits around water, not only water use, but water consumption, that means the water removed from the watershed, is the global food trade, where you could grow something in the proper season and sell it to your neighbors or exchange it with your neighbors and then can it for the winter. But no, we have to have those great big fat hormone-laden strawberries from California or whatever. And in thinking only about where it's cheapest to produce this stuff, we're pulling up massive amounts of water and transporting it around the world in what's called virtual water. Virtual water is the water that's embedded in something that is then exported or used. And in fact, our water footprint, we're told, oh, your water footprint is what you use in your home and your garden or your business every day. But no, that's only 1/10 of your water. The real water use is the water embedded in the food you eat. The computers you use takes a tremendous amount of water to make the computer chips and so on. And so we are using our water, and we're taking it from where we can get at it and displacing it. We're also taking land-based water and we're moving it into major cities. And if these cities, and think of some of them, the 10 million, 20 million, 30 million people, if they're anywhere near the oceans, they're sucking up that land-based water and they're dumping it in the oceans, treated or untreated, usually untreated, but we're displacing land-based water. And a recent study said that about 1/4 of the cause of oceans rising is not climate change as we have understood it, but because of the displacement of land-based water. Literally, you're transferring rivers and lakes and aquifers and dumping them in the ocean. So we have over 100 countries in the world drying up. And when I tell you there are bodies of water that are drying up, I cannot exaggerate. I've just finished a new book called Blue Future, Protecting Water for People and the Planet Forever. And I do get to the what to do part of it, but I have to start with what's wrong and tell the story. And basically, we are extracting and mining our water sources to death. We have major bodies of water that are gone. The Ogallala Aquifer in the United States, that's the body of water that goes down the western spine of the U.S. that produces most of their food and produces a great deal of food for export. The U.S. Department of Agriculture says will be gone in our lifetime. I cannot get people to understand when I speak in the U.S. that it's just like this blanket of can't be, how can, is there somebody will find a technology or something for it. I just received a report on China and their use of coal-fired plants and the destruction of water for the coal for these hydroelectric plants. And this report said that 1/2 of the rivers of China are gone since 1990. 1/2 of the rivers in China have dried up since 1990. So we are a planet running out of accessible clean water. And I won't throw any more studies except this one at you, and that was one done by the big water-intensive industries, food and beverage industries, and they said that by 2030, it's not very long away, the demand for water in our world will outstrip supply by 40%. If you look at the graphs, the demand is going straight up and the supply is going straight down. It's really important for us to have that as a backdrop when we look at something like fracking in New Brunswick, because in my very deep belief, and I think Ron and other First Nations people would say, well, what have we been telling you since the beginning of time? There is no such thing as water to waste. There is no such thing as water to harm. There is no such thing as extraneous extra water. This myth of abundance is exactly that. It is simply a myth that we can continue to treat water as if it's a never-ending resource. And I truly think it really started with the tap. You know, that you could turn on a tap and suddenly you were divorced from having to go to a water source and see if everybody was taking too much or was so-and-so dumping their animal carcasses in and hurting other people's supply. You could feel and touch your water, and you had a relationship with it. Or as the saying goes in Africa, you go to the watering hole, yes, for water, but to share your stories and your dreams. You know, it was also a social occasion, but we've separated ourselves into our homes, and we have all these taps. The first time I ever went to a community in the Global South many years ago now, where I really saw water poverty, water desperation, I came home and counted the places in my house, and I don't have a fancy house, very middle-class, ordinary house. I counted that I had 7 places that I could turn the water on, if you included the tap out front and the tap out back, where I could run it and run it and run it and run it and run it, and nobody would say anything, and I could just run it as long as I wanted. And it just struck me that that tap has been a kind of symbol, much like bottled water is, which is where you separate water from yourself. In that case, you put it in plastic and sell it for profit. But that notion that you can separate yourself from this water has been a really harmful one. So modern humanity sees a river. We don't see a beautiful river that gives life. We see a hydroelectric dam and all the money that that brings with it. So this is opening up the whole and the question about what we do in this country. Now, we have not had adequate protections of our fresh water, not in any of our provinces and not federally. Our federal act is 43 years old. We have not mapped our groundwater. We don't know if allowing this much groundwater taking is sustainable. I bet my bottom dollar it's not, but we don't know that. We have no national drinking water standards. We're one of the few so-called industrialized countries in the world that has no national drinking water standards. But not only have we not done what we should do, but the Harper government has just undone the tools that we had in the first place. And this, by the way, as you probably know, was the origin of the Idle No More movement. It was when the omnibus bills were passed. The Harper government gutted the Fisheries Act, which used to protect all fish habitat, and if you put anything deleterious to aquatic life and fish habitat into a living river or lake in Canada, you could be criminally charged. They gutted the Canada Environmental Assessment Act to the point where 3,000 assessments that were either underway or about to start were cancelled. They're just, basically, it's the cabinet, Harper cabinet, that decides if a project goes ahead. I think pretty well you're going to guess which way they're going to go all the time. And then they gutted the Navigable Waters Protections Act. And that means that 99% of our lakes and rivers in Canada are not protected from a pipeline carrying the most toxic of crude oil or bitumen, fracked gas or oil or whatever, going over, around, or under them. There is no protection. And one of the many tragedies of the Lake Megantic crime, and I don't think it was the engineer who committed the crime, I think it was the government of our two countries that totally deregulated the energy. But one of the crimes of Lac Megantic was that Lac Megantic was one of the lakes that was delisted as being protected under the Navigable Waters Protection Act. So this is a government that has absolutely gutted the few protections that we have, which is why I said we are so now dependent on the protections that are still built into the treaties of First Nations. So this has all opened up the door. This is all about opening up everything for the big corporations. This is about opening up energy. This is about opening up mining. This is a government that has basically said to the transnational corporations of the world, come on in, take what you want, we won't ask any questions. And it's very important for us to go back and remember about these trade agreements, because these trade agreements give these corporations phenomenal rights. They come into our country, and if their country and our country, as we have in NAFTA, as they're wanting to sign with China, if you have an agreement, the corporations from those countries can sue our government for billions of dollars if it tries to rein in their bad behavior. One example is that the government-owned energy company CNOOC of China was allowed to buy $16 million worth of investment in the oil sands and the tar sands, and now the government is talking about signing a foreign investment protection and a promotion agreement, which would give that company the right to sue if it thinks that it's been lied to or whatever, which this company could easily turn around and say, well, we invested here because we thought you were going to have all these pipelines to carry this oil away. And if you say no to these pipelines, we have the right to sue. We actually have a legal opinion to the effect that we could be sued for billions and billions of dollars by energy industries. There was an actual case. A company called Abitibi-Bowater was operating in Newfoundland. They were a pulp and paper company. They operated there for years. And they went bankrupt a few years ago. They left, and they left all the jobs, left all the pensions. They walked away, and they said, and now we want financial compensation for the water rights we left behind. And the government, it was Danny Williams at the time, said, excuse me, you had those water rights when you were making jobs here, creating jobs here, but that's our water. And so they launched a NAFTA challenge, a Chapter 11 under NAFTA, where a corporation can bypass the government and sue another government. And instead of fighting for them at a NAFTA tribunal, the Harper government turned around and gave them $130 million. So basically what they were saying is, you know, this is a precedent that we're prepared to set. Now, understand what we're saying here. Under these increasing trade agreements and investment agreements, and there are almost 3,000 bilateral agreements like this now between countries, under these agreements, a corporation can claim to own the water that it has been using for energy, for fracking. If you let foreign companies come in here, or we let them into New Brunswick, and then a future government decides to change its mind, it can not only, sue, from here to hell for you ever trying to kick them out or rein them in, but they could also say that they actually physically own the water that they're using. So this is a transition. We talk about it as corporate rule, where we see these corporate states really helping, or corporate-friendly states helping to hand over power that used to belong to the people. So I wanted to take the time to say this, because I think that the fight that we've got here on fracking in New Brunswick is set against that backdrop. And it makes it, for me, much more important for us to really stand our ground, because those of us who still are blessed to live in a part of the world with some clean water left, and there are parts of the world that don't have that anymore, have a special responsibility to take care of that water in a really, really important way. Now, fracking is a horrible new operation, a new way. The modern way of fracking is a terrible new blight on the landscape all over the world. It is exploding all over the world. Plans in China for fracking within not many years, they're talking 6 or 7 years, will use an equivalent of water of half of all of the water for all of industry in China. Venezuela is planning fracking operations that will use water equivalent to all the public water used in all of Venezuela together. What we're talking about are companies and governments colluding to let these companies use and abuse water that doesn't exist. In other words, even places where there are huge shortages of water, and I just told you that China has destroyed half its rivers, or the corporations operating in China have destroyed half the rivers since 1990. We are talking about countries without water planning to allow fracking to happen at this absolutely explosive rate. As you know, fracking uses huge amounts of water. In Pennsylvania, which you can now see, which was rural 10 years ago. I mean, it was, if you had a satellite on it at night, rural Pennsylvania was dark. Right now it is just a floodlight from the satellite. You should Google it. It's amazing to look at. In Pennsylvania, they use 15 million liters of water for each fracked well. The biggest fracking operation probably in the world, or it's generally agreed, is in northeastern British Columbia in the Horn River area, and their operation used 600 Olympic-sized swimming pools for every gas well pad, which holds several wells. I mean, we are just talking massive amounts of water, and there's a fabulous new film called Fractured Land, featuring a young First Nations leader, Caleb Ben, that's going to be out soon, and we're going to be bringing him across the country, and I urge you to see this because it's a Canadian version and a First Nations version of Gasland, and really tells the story of what's happening there and to fight back. Fracking poisons local water sources. As you know, the corporation that discovered this in the first place, Dick Cheney's company, don't you love it, of George Bush fame, got the recipe for fracking to be named a trade secret. So there are court cases going on in the United States to force them to disclose the exact chemicals, but we really don't need that. There have been a number of studies, one very important American study that is respected by all, I mean even the industries having to answer to this, says there are 600 chemicals used in fracking. A quarter of them are carcinogenic, and half of them can cause very serious other side effects. Something like benzene, which is used regularly and is a carcinogen in fracking, from one single fracked well, a benzene can contaminate 400 billion liters of drinking water. So what we're talking about is an entire river system, we're talking about an entire watershed, we're talking about an entire aquifer, we're talking about places where people live and where people are being moved. And there was a story that came out of Pennsylvania today. A family had had their water ruined on their farm and complained loudly and bitterly about the company. They came to a settlement with the company. It's undisclosed how much it was. It wasn't a lot, apparently. It was enough to move the family away where they're going to resettle, because they can't resell their property, of course. And the agreement was that neither they nor their children, who are 7 and 9 years old, can ever speak against fracking again for as long as they live, and that includes the children. That is a true story that came out of the U.S. today. They release huge amounts of methane gas. You know the story of the contamination of wells. And the fight is here. The fight is in New Brunswick. I happen to believe, and I even more so since I heard the first two speeches here tonight about the size of what we're dealing with here, that they've got their eye on New Brunswick as a Pennsylvania of Canada. And this is going to be one of the areas that they just don't think there's going to be a fight back. And boy, did they ever have another thing coming. The other threat, not that we don't have lots, but the other major new threat that we need to talk about tonight is the Energy East pipeline that TransCanada has announced that is going to be moving through our communities, going through my community as well in Ottawa, coming right across the country along the New Brunswick Maine border and to St. John, New Brunswick for export from the deep port there. And this is an extremely dangerous pipeline. A great deal of it is going to be through an old gas pipeline that was built in the early 1970s, which does not properly hold what this stuff is called diluted bitumen. Bitumen is the tar sands. It's called tar sands because it's like tar and it's so thick it can't move through the pipeline without some kind of dilution, so they dilute it with heavy chemicals to move it along. So it's toxic, and if there's any break in the spill, and there are on average 2 spills a day in Alberta alone, what you're spilling is some of the most toxic energy oil on Earth. In Kalamazoo, Michigan, they had a spill 3 years ago that spilled almost 4 million liters of this toxic dilbit, it's called diluted bitumen, and it's sunk to the bottom because it's heavy, the bottom of the watershed, and they can't get it out. And they now figure it's more dangerous to try to remove it, but I mean, it's absolutely destroyed the watershed. This is the future. More lac-megantics are the future. We're now learning about how much of this bitumen is being shipped across the Great Lakes in ships and barges. In Superior, Wisconsin, they're talking about they've got a refinery that accepts this and refines this tar sands oil, but they're also talking about building a deep dock facility that will allow them to turn it around, take it from the pipe, put it on barges, and send it back across the Great Lakes on barges. And I mean, can anybody make this up? I was just up in Lake Huron last week, and the communities on Lake Huron are vying to be the community that receives nuclear waste from Bruce Power to put in deep earth depositories. One of them, the one that may win on Saugeen Shores, will be less than a kilometer from Lake Huron. Could you make it up? And one of the communities vying for this is Walkerton, where they had the terrible. Do we learn? So think about this pipeline and the Bay of Fundy and the St. John River and the St. Lawrence and the incredible threat. And this is all for export. And by the way, it's going to be put in the language of jobs. We need the jobs. And my family comes from New Brunswick. My father's father was sometimes employed, sometimes not, in Pointe du Chêne, and we had a famous Uncle Mike who he had a wooden leg, and he used to pretend he'd lost it somehow heroically, but he actually got drunk and fell under a train one night and was cut off. But he used to love to wear long pants, and he'd sit in nice tea parties where people didn't know him, and he'd get a hammer and nail his leg. He thought, I mean, really, I love my family. I had a great Aunt Helen who used to take all her clothes off and run up and down the highway. She had a crush on one of the RCMP officers. This is true. I couldn't make this up. I had another great aunt who died, and they were giving her a wake in the house, and this was from Newfoundland. This wasn't New Brunswick, so they're even worse in Newfoundland, right? And the wind blew the door shut or something. She sat right up. She wasn't dead at all. She lived to have 5 children and 15 grandchildren or something after that. So this is my part of the world where I come from, and I know about the jobs issue here, but this is no way to create jobs. This is no way to create jobs by putting at threat and at risk our water and our air and our land. And think of what any spill would do to the current jobs in the fisheries, in farming, and just think of the potential loss. I mean, when I think of jobs, yeah, there'll be lots of cleanup jobs. Those are the jobs that I see. And when they promise jobs, give them this back. And this is what President Obama just said, because the energy industry promised that the Keystone Pipeline would create 20,000 jobs. He says, no, it will create 2,000, at the most 2,000 temporary construction jobs and between 50 and 100 permanent jobs. That's what all those promises come to. So we really have to fight this. And I want to back Ron up when he said that sometimes we have to put ourselves and our bodies on the line. And I did that for the first time in my life on Parliament Hill almost 2 years now. This September, it was a very lovely hot September day, and I had been down at the protest for Keystone Pipeline at the White House, and happened to be with my husband, who's a lawyer, who did not want me to get arrested down there, because he said, they're going to put it on your record, and every time you try to get into the States, you're not going to be able to, which is how they're controlling our behavior, right? So at one point I was going like this, and he was like this. So I came back and decided, okay, I'll do it here. We had a protest on Parliament Hill on September 26th, 2 years ago. And so the idea was, it was all worked out with the RCMP first, and we had wonderful First Nations drumming and wonderful. Again, this was the First Nations, non-First Nations just coming together in an incredible show of support. And if you crossed a small barrier, there were, enough police to take on, a total invasion. There were snipers on Parliament Hill. It's like me. Are you crazy? What are you doing? It was just insane. But anyway, so we decided, many of us decided to get arrested, but I just forgot to tell my husband, you see. So, and I'd said to him, now, it's going to be really boring, don't come over. And he said, okay, I won't, I've got a busy day. So those of us getting arrested put on a green armband. So I'm sitting there on the lawn listening to the drumming and really getting into it and kind of nervous the way Ron described it. And along comes Andrew and says, what's that green armband? And I'm saying, what green armband? He turned out to be supportive, but it was really an amazing experience, because you really are confronted with a power that, it can be, and I know that we've heard stories of RCMP sometimes being kind and sometimes not so kind, and so you don't know what you're going to meet, but you do lose your power. And I'll never forget, being arrested with the the cuffs and so on. And the police officer who arrested me knew who I was, and he really didn't want to arrest me. And he kept asking me to go back over the barrier. And he finally said, "Miss Barlow, if I have to go home tonight and tell my wife I arrested you, she's just going to kill me." I said, "Please tell her I made you do it. This is not your fault. If you'd like me to write something out, although it's difficult with my hands here." But I think that more and more we are going to have to say, we have to find local, personal ways to stand up and say no, because we are a planet that has got not our values wrong in here, but the main economic and social development model for our world is just wrong. It's the tyranny of the 1%. It's just fundamentally wrong. And we have to fight it at every level, but sometimes the best fights come straight off the ground, and they just become something so powerful, and they just materialize, and they become something unstoppable. And I'll tell you what I know about water, and I've been working in this for a long time now. This is an issue of the heart. It's also an issue of the head. There are a lot of statistics, there's a lot to learn, there's a lot we need to understand, but this is an issue of the heart, and everybody gets it. Everybody gets it, that children get sick when they drink bad water, that it's not right that people have to watch their children be sick and die because they don't have money for water. Everybody gets it. And I think that if we can come at some fundamental principles around water, I think we can start to establish those principles for everything, because we have to start somewhere. And so I'm just going to offer to you what I call the 4 principles of a new water ethic. A new water ethic means that we have to change the way we relate to water, and I would argue nature in a larger sense, but let's just talk water for the moment. And that is that it's not a resource for our personal pleasure, profit, and convenience, but rather the most essential element of a living ecosystem that gives us all life. And we have to start having reverence for it. We have to start understanding and appreciating. We've got to start taking it in our hands and feeling it and understanding it again. And that means that everything we do and every policy, whether it's trade or whether it's energy or whether it's industrial or whether it's food or whether it's the economy, no matter what, has to ask the question, what's the impact on water? I have watched where decisions are made to increase biofuel production by the agriculture department of governments, and then that increased agriculture is traded around the world, or those biofuels are traded around the world by the trade department. They're working there, they are. And then there's the few people working off on water on the side, not being paid much and being fired by the Harper government. And nobody's asking them, do we have the water for this? It takes a huge amount of water to produce biofuels. We don't have the water. Biofuels are one of the biggest problems in the world, water-wise, and to protect air, we're killing water. In California alone, they have announced subsidies for biofuels in California that would use a third of the Colorado River. They don't have a third of the Colorado River, or rather, a third of the Colorado River is already gone. So it's that lack of understanding of putting together this whole picture. What would it look like if we had a trade agreement that said you can't harm water and you have to protect local communities' right to protect their water? It would be fundamentally different than anything that we have. So very quickly, because I want to talk with you, not at you, the 4 fundamental principles are that water is a human right. And that may sound like a motherhood to you, but we fought tooth and nail to get the United Nations to recognize water as a human right. And the country that led the fight against it was Canada. And I was not working as a volunteer, I was an advisor to the 63rd President of the UN General Assembly, Miguel Descado Brockman, a wonderful man, a liberation theologian priest from Nicaragua. He had 1 year, because it's a 1-year term, and he said to me, come and help. Let's get the right to water. And we worked with a man named Pablo Sono, who was the ambassador from Bolivia to the United Nations, and we just did it. Pablo put the resolution, simple resolution that drinking water and sanitation are fundamental human rights, to the United Nations General Assembly. Well, you'd have thought they asked for the moon, the stars, and the sun, right? We weren't ready, we need many more years of research, how dare you force our hand, blah, 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 blah. And then they started getting him to weaken it, and would he take sanitation out, and this and that. And he said, you know what, I'd rather lose a good resolution than win a bad one. And I also want to see which countries are going to vote against it. So on July 28th, 2010, I was there in the balcony of the UN General Assembly with some of my staff, and holding their hands, because we came to a vote. I was sure we were going to lose, and I was saying, now, don't you worry, it's okay to lose the first time, but we'll be back in 2 years or 5 years, we'll be back until we get it, blah, 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 blah. Pablo Solon gets up and he gives a speech, and he says, in the global south, every 3.5 seconds a child dies of dirty water or lack of water. And then he goes like this, 1, 2, 3, held up half a finger, and the place went silent. And then he gave one of the most beautiful speeches I have ever heard in my life. And then they went to a vote. Now, when they vote at the UN, it all goes up on they just sit in their seats. It goes up on a big electronic board. And 122 countries voted in favor. None voted against. Even Canada only abstained. 41 abstained. And the place broke out in, fabulous applause. It was an incredible moment. We were all very moved. But then countries like Canada and the US and Great Britain got up and lectured Pablo. They turned their fingers like this, and you forced the vote, and we didn't do blah, blah, blah. And Pablo Solon stood there, pardon my language, with a big shit-eating grin, as if to say, what part of I just won and you didn't, do not get? Like, help me out here, right? A lovely moment. In Canada, that right to water now means that our government, whether they like it or not, is obliged to honor the human right to water, and that means they have to undertake to change the terrible situation of drinking water in First Nations communities. But it also means, and here's another obligation that comes, they are also supposed to stop third parties from destroying the drinking water of any community. So I believe we can use this new right to water in our fracking work, and I want us to explore this. The second principle is that water is a public heritage. It is not only a human right, but it belongs to, it doesn't belong in the sense of I own it, but it is the responsibility of the whole community. And no one has the right to buy it, trade it, sell it, hoard it for money. No one has the right to put it on the stock market, as T. Boone Pickens is doing in Texas, to buy up tons of the Ogallala aquifer and resell it to developers for a huge profit. Nobody has that right. And we have to assert our collective rights to govern and to protect, fiercely protect this public trust. We need to call water a public trust. I worked with the people in Vermont. They had beautiful groundwater, like New Brunswick, but it was unprotected, and they had a lot of companies, particularly bottled water companies, coming in and just draining local aquifers. So they passed a law that their groundwater is a public trust. And they actually said that not only is it a public trust, but the priorities are drinking water for everyone, equally, ecosystem protection, and local food security. So they even named local food security rather than food for a few rich industrial farmers to sell all over the world. They actually see the connection between local farming, organic farming, much more sustainable food production, and their water. And they were able to successfully challenge a nuclear facility there that had been dumping tritium into their water system, because they said it's our water because we have a water license for it. And the people of Vermont were able to say, no, we've got a new law, and this water belongs to the people of Vermont, and you do not have the right to do this. And so they were able to stop them. So we've got to get the tools. Martin Luther King said, legislation may not change the heart, but it will restrain the heartless. We need to establish the notion, and here in New Brunswick, we have to do away with that law that says that people who own property own the water. They do not own the water. That cannot be. And we need to establish that these waters are commons. I mean, if you have a farm, of course the water there is for your use. But if you are, own a big property on a lake, you can't stop people from using that lake, other people from using it, that there has to be the notion of this joint heritage. The third is that the water has rights itself, like water itself outside of its usefulness to us or its service to us, or even its notion as a public trust, that water has rights. And we have got to make our own laws compatible with the laws of nature. I have a colleague who says that the way we treat nature will one day be looked at, if there are future generations, will one day be looked at by future generations the way we see slavery, and say, how could that have been? How could people have enslaved another people? And there will come a time when they will look at us and say, how could we have enslaved nature? So it's not to say, of course, if nature has rights that you can't go fishing, but you cannot fish a species to extinction, that there has to be a respect and a balance, and that nature is not our property. And again, First Nations teach us this, that it is only ours to use and care for while we're here, and it's ours to pass on to 7 generations ahead. And so to do that, we have to respect the fundamental human rights of nature. And a number of us, after the failed meeting in Copenhagen in 2009, December 2009, of the climate summit, which was awful. When you got off the plane, little people looked like elves dressed in Coca-Cola uniforms were handing out Coca-Cola. It was like the UN summit brought to you by the UN and Coca-Cola, right? And everywhere you went, there were billboards advertising Coca-Cola, happy children running through nice grass and nice clean water, and Coca-Cola was going to save the world. They even had a slogan. Instead of it being Copenhagen, it was Copenhagen, hope that there were climate summit. I started calling it Copenhagen. It was absolutely brutal. The police had the right. They suspended civil law. They were arresting people. It was horrible. And so when I left, I was approached by one of these little elves to say goodbye with a little bit of Coke at the plane, and I must say I used the F word on an elf, and I really felt a little badly afterwards, but not too badly. I'm going to find her one day and apologize, try to explain to her why she so set me off, just because it had so miserably failed. So Evo Morales, the president of Bolivia, invited us, those of us who wanted to really do something, to come to Cochabamba, Bolivia, and they expected 6,000 or 7,000, 38,000 of us descended on them, and out of it came the Universal Declaration on the Rights of Mother Earth, which you can get if you want to go to our website. You can find under the Rights of Nature. There's a publication that we have. So I really think we have to start thinking about the next phase of our laws and our understanding about the rights of other species than ourselves. And again, the First Nations teaches us that. And then finally, my final principle is that water can teach us how to live together. I believe that we are either going to be a planet that divides into conflict and war over water, and I can tell you right now 24 places where people are using war as a weapon, at least 24 off the top of my head. But I also know of places where people are saying, look, we have all these religious differences and historical and political differences, but we're running out of our shared water source. Let's talk about our shared water source and see if we can't find a way together to bring this water source back. And how do we do that? We can't just think about ourselves. We have to think about you too. Because if we think about ourselves and you think about yourselves, then we're all going to continue to do this bad thing that's killing this river. But if we think about what you need and what we need and how we could share and how we could act differently and how we could write up an agreement that would be different than the ones that say, this is my share, this is my share, then maybe we could find a way to address other issues that have torn us apart. And I have this dream that water can become nature's gift to teach us how to live with each other in a different way and to live more lightly on the earth. And I think that what you're doing here in New Brunswick with this water movement, and I urge us to put it in terms of protection of water. Fracking is doing many bad things, so will the pipeline, but I think the protection of water and the protection of health and the protection of next generation's right to that water is absolutely what will speak to people. I think that when you have that kind of truth, that kind of image in your mind, I think it will bring people of all political stripes together in one incredible movement. I just want to end with, and I know I got to stop in a second, but I want to end with one story, and that is the story of a place called Site 41 up in the Georgian Bay, which we fought and won. And this is a beautiful rural prime farmland area where they have an aquifer called the Alliston Aquifer that's been tested as having the cleanest water on earth. And before there was a Clean Water Act in Ontario, they agreed to allow a dump site to be built there, right on this very delicate watershed, right on the Georgian Bay. And the people there fought it for 2 decades, but 4 years ago it came to a head. They'd run out of court time, they'd run out of everything, there was nothing left to do, and the county council, which is made up of the mayors of all the little villages, the warden of the county council was a really tough, mean guy, and he was just going to plow this through. So they started bringing in the heavy equipment, and they confiscated the land. Of course, they'd done that years before, and they started digging the cell. So we got very involved, my organization, and me personally, I was down there a lot. And the Beausoleil First Nations women, First Nations island group there, decided to set up a peace camp with the permission of a farmer on his land right adjacent to the site where they were digging. And every morning the women and others would just happen to hold a prayer vigil, and it would just happen to be in front of these big trucks, right? So for 5 weeks they held these early morning prayer vigils, and they happened to last for hours, and finally the trucks would leave. And so we held them up until it was too late, the frost was going to come. So the warden was furious, and he got the police to start laying charges, and he started arresting these young mothers, and it was terrible. They arrested an 82-year-old farm woman, this farm couple. They went to their home, and she was baking butter tarts for the church bazaar when they got there, and she taught them. She was a school teacher, and she had taught these 2 policemen. She said, "Now come in and have tea and butter tarts, and then we'll go." Of course, we took the opportunity to phone the media. So she was able to say to a packed media group outside her home, "If I'm going down, I'm going down for water," right? She'd never had so much as a parking ticket. But I tell you this because it all came to a head. We had a moratorium at the end of that month, a vote on a moratorium, and the place was packed. There were maybe 2,000 people out, some outside, some inside. Just a wild night of people so furious and pent up, and there was some food flying around. It was raw democracy. And the person who led our side, it was half and half. We didn't know how the vote was going to go, and there were some councillors would not commit, and we didn't know. So the woman on our side gave a wonderful speech, and then the man who was championing the pro-Site 41 side got up to speak, and he was the mayor of a township called Tiny Township, and he was a very big man, bigger than Tiny Township, I can assure you. A retired business guy, and always loved to go after the protesters. He used to have a saying, "Get up early, beat a protester." He was tough, and he loved, and he said, "I'll fight for Site 41," and he came, of course, to vote against the moratorium. He gets up to speak, he starts to cry, and you can hear a pin drop. And he says, "When I got up this morning, I was going to come in here and vote against this moratorium. But," he said, "I went into my home office, and my grandchildren had found a Site 41 sign, and they put it on my desk, and they wrote the word Papa on it." And he said, "In that moment, my job description changed." And he said, "I became a steward of the water of Simcoe County, and as long as I shall live, Site 41 will never open." And Site 41 has never opened. It's returned to farmland. So I want to just end with these words that we are all stewards of the water here. And any of those of you who stood out first and stood together and put yourself in front of those machines and been arrested, I thank you from the bottom of my heart. But I also think, I know this from dealing with very small children, that there is something happening out there. There is a sea change in our attitudes, and it took a long time. Think about how long it took for women's rights, for recognition of racial equality. Think of same-sex relationships. Think of, I don't know, drinking and driving, or God, they used to smoke on airplanes. I can remember that. Things change, times change, people change, and we can change this world of ours. This world of ours is, as Arundhati Roy says, it's not just that a better world is possible, but we're building it, we're creating it, and it starts here in New Brunswick with this promise to protect this water, because it does not, as our First Nations sisters and brothers tell us, belong to us. It is for all generations and for all times, and I promise to come back again and again and again until we win. Thank you so much.